And welcome back to another episode of K Let's Scope. Hello, and welcome to K Let's Scope. Hello, and welcome back to K Let's Scope. And welcome back to K Let's Scope. Hello, and welcome back to the 8th episode of K Let's Scope. So, unfortunately, in post-production, I have found that my audio never recorded for this podcast. So, I have managed to salvage a good amount of things from the podcast, and Adam and Reyva will be doing the speaking today. However, I hope you do enjoy the podcast and enjoy Adam and Reyva's talking points.
So I think a lot of proponents for space colonization say that it's going to become a necessity because of overpopulation, or the globe just simply can't sustain enough people. I mean, there are definitely already issues with overpopulation and food in certain places. But I also think that in the past, issues with food have been solved by greater agricultural advancements. And I think it may be possible, it likely is possible, that we can expand the capacity of the Earth, and that I think it may be very likely that the Earth is not nearing its capacity of people if we um, plan correctly and have new agricultural technology. So I don't actually think that it is the one and only solution to an issue of overpopulation. So I do think that I do think that that could be a solution for overpopulation, but not quite in the way that China did it. I do know that many developing countries have had some birth control policies. I think maybe it was Bangladesh that enacted some policies of birth control, and that actually improved its economy a lot. And also, but didn't do it in a way where it's just policy where what each family could have one child or two children, but more that increasing access to contraceptives, increasing education, especially for women, because um, that decreased how many children they had, and also career opportunities. So I do think that birth control is an option for overpopulation, but not quite in the way that China did it.
I believe that it's very necessary. Space colonization is extremely necessary because just to acknowledge what Adam was saying earlier, currently Earth cannot adequately support current populations. Um, like for example, a person living under a government that mismanages agriculture is not going hungry because the Earth cannot really handle their consumption. Global warming right now is making it so that larger portions of Earth will be underwater or susceptible to extreme weather, and these effects will deteriorate Earth's landscape completely, thus making space colonization much more necessary, even more now, because as of right now, Earth cannot currently and adequately support current populations. Thus, our only option is to use space colonization.
Well, I'd actually like to talk a little bit about the point of climate change, and that while climate change is deteriorating the Earth and is deteriorating its capacity for populations, I do think that maybe we have to consider that if climate change is damaging how many people we can have on the Earth, maybe the solution isn't to leave Earth, but rather we should be investing more money into things that will stop climate change, like better green energy solutions. Even though climate change, some of the effects of climate change will happen no matter what at this point, but I think it may actually be a better investment of money for governments and private corporations to be investing in climate technologies rather than space technologies, because it almost seems like it's not the right solution. It's not addressing the issue if we just rather solve the problem.
Yeah, so I understand that as of right now, well, obviously, space colonization will be costly, and that we can use all of that money to create agricultural technologies right now to possibly cure world hunger. But there's no guarantee that better technologies will be invented or that they will prevent overpopulation at all, because right now nobody is setting that in place. Nobody, that's not set in stone at all. So there's no guarantee that that would cure world hunger at all either.
I mean, I kind of would agree with Reva that like the 19 billion dollars that go to NASA, if they weren't going to NASA, I don't know if they really would go to world hunger. And also, if the intention was to take that money and put it towards solving world hunger, I don't know how um realistically possible that would be. Because in theory, it is possible, but in terms of coordinating that and I mean the amount of infrastructure needed and cooperation and international cooperation needed for that, I don't know if that would actually be plausible. Well, sure. Like to build on your point, I actually know of that there is like enough debris in space that there's a possibility that it with the right amount of collisions of debris that there could be we could actually like block ourselves off from space with if enough pieces of debris crash into each other and like combust. I think I don't know the details, but creating like a basically a barrier between us and space. So I think space debris is something that needs to be that is it's a big issue and that it needs to be considered because especially for something as major as space colonization, if like NASA or SpaceX or doesn't reconsider their like waste, it could inhibit us from ever going to space for like hundreds of years, and could also and because there's going to be so many, if space colonization were to happen, there'd be so many more trips to space. It would just create a much more dangerous environment around the Earth. Well, I mean, I have to, obviously, I can't deny that what 18,000 jobs being added is positive, and that is certainly a positive effect of NASA. But I do think that perhaps there are other agencies or other just other places where maybe that those same people's jobs could be used in something that is perhaps a little more productive, like research and development having to do with rather than space exploration, maybe once again like green technology and also these agricultural technologies that I've discussed before. So of course, 18,000 people getting jobs is amazing, but it also has to be considered that it's once again like all this money being put in, it's also all these jobs being put into something that perhaps isn't as lucrative or just isn't as useful as some people think it could be, or is won't actually have like a net positive for humanity.
Um, I do agree with that as well. But the great thing about space work is that it brings different professions together. Scientists, engineers, technicians, and media and communication workers often collaborate on space projects. That opens up interests for the future, especially for our generation, and just overall benefits us completely. But I do agree with what Adam had to say earlier.
Well, I was just going to say that I do think that the um the specialization, like the specialized jobs that um people at NASA have, like aerospace engineers, those can't be like directly translated into what I said, like into some other fields of development. So that is also something to be considered, that NASA is a place where people with very specialized jobs and interests can be and still benefit people, but so that's like two sides of that argument. Well, the thing is that, and this is a common argument against people among people against space colonization, is that at this point, space travel and space exploration, just anything having to do with space, is essentially a rich man's game, right? It costs a ton of money to go to space, so the only people that are going to space are either companies funded by very rich people like SpaceX and Elon Musk, or governments. So then it does raise the question of when we bring people to when we have the opportunity to bring people to somewhere like Mars, is it just going to be like rich Westerners going there? Because like there's so many countries that don't have space programs because they simply can't afford it. They have way more important things to do. So then it raises the question of, is space just going to become a place where like wealthy Westerners can go while they leave behind the problems of the Earth, and they leave it up to poorer countries and poorer people to take care of. So I don't know if it's as much about amount, because I'm sure there would be enough people to go and start new lives, but it's about like who and what are those implications of who can actually access. Like would I go to a Mars colony? I I don't know. It's a tough question because I mean, on the one hand, it's like, whoa, you're in space, it's really cool, but also I think from a if we're talking more on like a micro scale, space is like living in space would probably be really, really hard. It's just so different. And also in earlier stages of colonization, generally it'd be people who are specialized, who have some sort of skills going there, so I don't know how much of a use I'd be in space. But if they really wanted me, maybe I would. I don't know.
I'd have to agree with Adam. I don't think knowing who I am right now, I probably would be of no use or of any help up at space. But it would be a really cool experience because as I am arguing in favor of space colonization and space exploration, if I was given the opportunity, I would definitely say yes.
Well, I would agree with you. I think space is like really, really scary of a place. And that also because when you think about it, as humans, we're like built to live on Earth. So going to somewhere that is so different, like Mars really is, as much as we're pretty close together in the same size. Mars's atmosphere is nothing like ours. Mars doesn't have any of the things that we like need to art to sustain ourselves. Mars has water, but it's mostly frozen. And so I can understand that like going to space would be very scary. But also even the process of going, like if because we think about life on Mars, also traveling in like a spaceship, because I think it's like at least a couple months. Um, a trip in like a small space, floating in the middle of no like if it shuts down, you're gone. So that I can understand is scary. And also what's scary when I think about that is because like Mars and Earth's orbits, they don't orbit like right next to each other. They have like different orbits. There's only a period of every like 2 years or so where you can actually send out a mission to make it to Mars in time with like the fuel that we have. So like if something happens on Mars, it might you might have to wait 2 years until like someone can come and help you. And by then, if it's bad enough, you're not going to be alive. So I can definitely understand space being a very scary place because it is.
I think that's also even though I just said that I don't know. I think that's it's a risk worth God, please cut that out. It's a risk worth taking because you never know what you'll find out there. You could end up dead, but you could also end up making it out alive. And you can just come down and share what you explored up there, and it's just a risk worth it. Very worth it.
Yeah, I think that's a salient point because it definitely is a risk, but when you do think about it, especially in the early stages of colonization, every person that would go to Mars is benefiting like humanity in some way if we think that like setting up a colony on Mars is benefiting humanity, then every person that goes there and begins the process of development, even if they themselves don't bear the fruits of colonization, it very well could benefit people generations in the future when it's necessary.
Yeah, yeah, I agree with that too. There are a lot of issues on Earth that need to be dealt with before we start thinking about space, because obviously, not obviously, but in this case, Earth does come first, especially with COVID happening. For example, research and development should not only be based on space technology, but right now we should be focusing on, let's say, trying to come up with more methods of producing green energy and coming up with how to directly and just end this whole pandemic before we go into space and try to come up with more issues that we would have to solve in space as well.
I agree, but I do also think with the amount of development that goes into space technology and the amount of money we put in, I do think that in the future it is likely that we'll be using much less fossil fuels to like fuel missions because I'm not sure about the statistics, but I think like we probably used many more fossil fuels to like fuel the Apollo missions than we do today to fuel like the SpaceX missions, which shows me that there may be a time in the future where space colonization, the amount of fossil fuels it uses, is not as harmful as it is not as harmful to humanity as it is good for humanity. What those fossil fuels are being used to do. But that's why I also think space. I agree with Reyva that space colonization has to be. It can't be something that we endeavor on now because it's also not completely necessary now, and it's also not as efficient as it could be, and that it's something that we maybe should be laying the groundwork for if people consider it necessary in the future, but it doesn't need to be endeavored on now. Sure. So I think once again, like that is another issue that needs to be thought about. However, I do think if it can possibly be addressed if, for example, Mars, we've sent rovers and we are constantly sending like non-human explorations to Mars. And so I think at a certain point, if Mars has some sort of microorganism or something that is dangerous to humans or that could possibly be, could carry some disease, it would be discovered. So I think if space colonization is to be endeavored on, that issue definitely does need to be thought about, but it could be solved through prior non-human exploration, especially because now, like there's constantly new advancements with artificial intelligence, or not even artificial intelligence, but just robots that aren't artificially intelligent, but can still benefit us.
Yeah, yeah, I agree with that. But using Sophian's his example of if we went up to space or we went to Mars and we found what did you say, a disease or something that, yeah, so if we brought that back to Earth, that if we're taking into account, let's say the pandemic is still around at that point, it probably won't be, but if it was, if something like COVID happened again, let's say a few years or 50 years, then we really don't need that because as I said earlier, we need to solve our own issues and we need to solve whatever is going on right now before we even try to imagine what type of risks we would be taking if we went to space. And God forbid we had to take back whatever happened in Mars because it's still unknown and we don't know what type of diseases are there and it could destruct the world and end the world completely if we're trying to be very dramatic about it.
That is true. However, I think it also needs to be considered that the way like the microorganisms, like the like bacteria and viruses work on Earth, they work they exist in a certain way that is compatible, quote unquote, with animals and with plants and like with us. They are built in a way that they can benefit off of us, and then obviously that makes us sick. But if we go to another planet where organisms are just created differently, like we don't know how, let's say, a some bacterium on Mars preys on like another living thing on Mars because that living thing may just function completely differently to the way we do. So if there are certain diseases that exist, it could be very likely that they don't affect us because they're just not. That's not how they're made. Our biologies are just simply not compatible. Also, I think as humans, we've learned to address like pandemics essentially, and we're not completely successful at it. But I do think it also would really depend on how like contagious and deadly the disease is. But if it's something along the lines of what we've addressed before, we could very likely um, solve that problem if it were to arise. Not that it's a problem that we want to give ourselves, but well, I mean, I'd like to talk a little bit about exploration versus colonization because obviously we've been doing space exploration for a very long time, but I do want to consider whether it is worth it because of the resources it uses, because of the potential danger it has, such as like the waste um, in our upper atmosphere. Is it? I want to really ask Reva, do you think is it worth it for the advancement of human knowledge? Is it worth what we're doing? And I'm not saying it isn't. I want to know your opinion on that. And also Sufyan.
Talking about if space exploration is worth it, right? Personally, in my opinion. I think, yeah. I mean, based on what we were talking about in the podcast, obviously earlier on the podcast, obviously there are loads of risks. Not taking into consideration space colonization, but just for space exploration, there are a lot of risks that come with it. But as humans, we are naturally curious, and we're always looking for a solution to even Earth's problems. And I think taking that risk and now might not be the best time as we agreed to go into space, but when it's the right time and when we have research and the right people working on the right team to go up into space, I believe that by exploring space properly, the right people, great things can happen.
Oh, well, actually, I would have to agree with you because I think that pretty much all of the space exploration we've been doing, as much as it is born out of human curiosity, I think a big part of it, it's really born out of international competition, right? we went to the moon just because Russia was planning to go to the moon and they had already had satellites in space. So I think a lot of it, as much as it is about furthering human knowledge, it also is a lot of it is rooted in inter-country competition. And then suddenly you have to ask the question, like, is it worth it if it's really just sort of like an ego battle between two countries? But also, I want to ask Reva a different question because you've been mentioning this whole time sort of the right time for space colonization and exploration. Do you have an idea of when is the right time, or do you think it's more like we'll know when it happens?
I think especially now, the US is obviously getting better, COVID case wise, but countries like India, they are not getting better. They're getting vaccinated, many citizens, but people who are lower class there are not being vaccinated. They're not being taken care of, and so that's why right now it's definitely not the right time to go into space. Because it cannot be pursued at the expense of Earth's own issues and of Earth's own people. So I don't have the right time per se as to when we should explore space, but a few years down the road, maybe 10 years or definitely years after the pandemic has fully ended and all of Earth's citizens are being accounted for, would be the right time to go up into space.
Great, thank you for having me.
Thank you. It was fun.